Hello, and I want to welcome all of the webinar attendees today. Thank you for your time. I know your schedules are very busy right now, so we're glad you're joining us today. We're really excited about our guests and the content we're sharing. I think it will be extremely valuable to everyone on the line as we recognize the massive impact that healthy buildings and indoor air quality can have on our people and organizations at large. I want to introduce myself. I'm Dean Stanberry, and I'm honored to be representing the International Facility Management Association, or IFMA for short, as the moderator for today's discussion. I currently serve as the first vice chair of IFMA's Global Board of Directors. IFMA is an association supporting over 22,000 members and in over 100 countries. You can learn more about the FM profession at ifma.org. So it's my pleasure to introduce our featured speakers. Our first is Joanna Frank, and Joanna is the founding president and CEO of the Center for Active Design, or CFAD, where she is focused on advancing design and development practices to foster healthy and engaged communities. And next up, we have Grant Morgan. Grant is the CEO and founder of biosafety technology company R0, which is dedicated to establishing a new standard of health via the built environment. So what are we talking about today? We're going to be talking about one of the most pressing and important public health challenges of our generation. As human beings, how do we keep ourselves safe in what is effectively our natural habitat, indoor spaces? Healthy buildings are all about working for people. But I want you to keep in mind that building codes as they exist today are essentially the bare minimum requirement. How does sustainability and healthy buildings work together? You know, we started out with LEED design standards back in the early 2000s. And following in those footsteps, healthy buildings are taking those design standards to the next levels. So what have we learned from the challenges of the last decade and the last few years? We're here today to talk about what it looks like to create a healthier, safer, and better future. Can you provide a bit more background on when and how each of you landed on this focus, and perhaps some data around the issues that you uncovered with the status quo along the way? Why don't we start with Joanna?
Yes, sure. Thank you. I'm happy to be here and talking about this subject. So I started working in the healthy building movement about a decade ago. Before that, I had been a real estate developer, actually building multifamily mixed use buildings in New York City. And the kind of the transition that my career has gone through actually kind of really mirrors what we've seen at large with the industry. And that is 10 years ago, the status quo was that really none of us were thinking about health when it came to buildings. Certainly my generation, none of us were educated about how buildings directly, measurably impact the health of the occupants of the building or the community at large. So I'm trained as an architect. Health never came up in my education, I would say. And then I think the other part of the status quo from 10 years until kind of now is that there was a huge body of knowledge out there about how our built environment impacted health, but it was all coming out of public health research. So it isn't that we don't know how buildings and how communities impact health. It is that we building professionals don't know. It isn't that that knowledge doesn't exist in the world. It's just that the biggest challenge that we saw, and the reason that kind of I got into this, was it's really about translating the existing knowledge. We have more than 5,600 peer-reviewed published research studies coming from public health. It's just that they are written, and they are really the audience that they're written for are other researchers in public health, and they needed to be translated to be directly applicable to the building industry to make sense from our perspective and to really resonate with us. So I think the status quo was the knowledge existed, but it existed in the academic world of public health and needed translating so that it was relevant to building industry. And then the other part of the status quo was there was no demand for healthy buildings 10 years ago. There wasn't very much demand for healthy buildings 3 years ago, if we're really being honest. Now there is unbelievable, unprecedented demand for healthy buildings because of obviously the global pandemic. So it's been a really interesting 10 years to see that demand grow. and to be kind of at this nexus between public health research and the building industry, whether you're an investor in real estate, a developer of real estate, the operator of real estate, or the folks who are managing the properties, the facility managers.
Thank you. Grant, how about you?
Yeah, so we're a little bit newer to this space than Joanna, and we've had the benefit of having the opportunity to learn from leaders and luminaries like Joanna and other experts in this space who have studied healthy buildings and the impact on human health for their entire careers. But R0 was founded right at the beginning of the pandemic, when we were watching kind of the world fall apart, and we felt compelled to jump in and do something to help, but learned quite a bit very quickly. And had a couple of realizations that sort of shape how we see the world, and those realizations happen to be sort of centered around what the status quo was. But number one, the realizations that humans are an indoor species. We spend 90% of our lives indoors, so those indoor spaces where we do spend our time have a massive impact on our overall health. As we started digging in and learning about what the status quo is, we realized we as humans have done a terrible job actually of keeping ourselves safe in the buildings that we occupy for 90% of our lives. And the evidence is pretty clear. Even before COVID, 40 million Americans get the flu every year, and somehow we've just accepted that that's normal. MRSA, or staph infections, kill more people annually in the United States than Parkinson's, emphysema, AIDS, and murder combined. And so, as Joanna mentioned, I think COVID catalyzed this sort of paradigm shift, this societal awareness of that relationship between indoor spaces and human health. And since the beginning of COVID, I think there's been an incredible amount of focus and energy directed towards this healthy building space. And I believe that COVID catalyzed what I refer to as sort of the healthy buildings movement. And Dean referenced LEED certifications a little bit earlier. I think we've been relatively successful over the last couple of decades at reducing the energy consumption and the carbon footprint of the built environment. And just like we've gone through that green buildings movement, I believe that we are now at the beginnings of a healthy buildings movement, where the focus has shifted to occupant health and safety, and we're actually paying attention to how do we actually tailor our buildings to serve the people that occupy them. So I think that at the end of the day, the realization is we need a new standard. We need to stop neglecting this problem that's existed forever. And so we're here to stand on the shoulders of giants like Joanna and her team, and learn from the public health research that already exists. But that's the last thing I'll say is sort of the tools and technologies, the body of knowledge, the science, it all exists, and it existed pre-COVID. But I think one of the potential silver linings of COVID is that it created this awareness and this focus where now there's companies like R0 and incumbents in the space that are really paying attention to applying that science and reaping the benefits of it, as an owner or an occupant of the building.
Thanks, Grant. Joanna, you've been working in this field for over a decade now. How has COVID exacerbated these issues?
Sure. So I think, COVID is obviously an infectious disease. So it directly affects folks as an infectious disease, so respiratory health, et cetera. But I think what is less understood is that actually indoor air quality, COVID itself, is an equity issue. It has also impacted mental health massively. And I would say from our perspective that you're going to see a greater impact on mental health in the long run from this pandemic than the actual kind of the impact of the direct impact of that respiratory disease. And we can predict that because we've seen that kind of data from past pandemics. One of the greatest impacts that you can have on your mental health is actually social isolation. So social isolation is alongside smoking and physical inactivity as one of the 3 leading causes of premature death every year. So social isolation is absolutely going to exacerbate issues around mental health, so anxiety, depression. It also just directly impacts your life expectancy, which I don't think people understand as well as maybe we should, and that we are a social species. It is detrimental on our health directly to be socially isolated. And obviously, COVID brought about social isolation, necessitated social isolation because we didn't know how to deal with it at the beginning. So those kind of triggers are very bad to our mental health. Mental health was actually already the leading cause of disability globally. So even before COVID, our mental health was terrible globally. And so it's only got worse. And we are seeing the greatest kind of impacts on our youngest generation. So the kids who have grown up through COVID, their mental health is really on a very dire trajectory, and also the oldest population who were the most affected by that social isolation and increased anxiety. So I think, yes, it is absolutely affecting people directly as a respiratory infectious disease, but it is also affecting people over the long haul to be socially isolated, to have that higher level of anxiety, right? There is an existential threat, right? This isn't like some, oh, I'm feeling under threat. It's like, no, you are actually under threat, folks. Huge disruption to people's income, disruptions to their normal routines, disruption obviously to education. So there's all of the kind of triggers that impact mental health were present in this pandemic and have been in other pandemics. So after the SARS pandemic, up to 40% of the population was actually suffering from PTSD after SARS. So PTSD is a very high level of mental health distress. So we, even at the beginning of COVID, and certainly the way that we wrote the standard, so Fitwel came out with a standard specifically, the viral response module was specifically looking at how do you impact infectious respiratory disease, but also how do you protect mental health? Because we knew, like right from the beginning, that this juggernaut of an issue around mental health was going to be with the whole population. So those are things that have been exacerbated. I would say that some of the benefits, as Grant just mentioned, are that we now have demand for healthy buildings. So we have known public health has known, for more than 100 years, that our built environment measurably impacts all aspects of our health, so our physical health and mental health, as well as social health, which includes equity and trust. Now there is demand for this, which there wasn't before. And so we can now marry the demand that is coming both from individuals as well as investors with all of that knowledge that already existed. And we can actually bring about some change. And we're seeing change happen very rapidly, especially for the building industry, which, it can't move that quickly. It's a big industry. So it's really interesting to see how we've got this coming together of demand, a newfound awareness of how we are all connected with each other. This has been a public health crisis. I think before COVID, we were having to explain the difference between individual health and public health. Everybody understands now that, you cannot live in a bubble and not actually participate in this larger kind of population health. So there's definitely been a lot of trauma and a lot of bad, negative things around COVID, but I think in the long run, it's up to us, right? It's our challenge now to make something positive come out of this suffering.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. I'll just touch on something Joanna laid out, but the inequality, the health equity, and the impact on COVID has disproportionately impacted underprivileged, underrepresented communities, and if you think about health, it's the foundation of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and so there are social consequences in addition to the ones Joanna mentioned. School and learning loss is a topic of conversation right now, given schools are reopening, and we've had one of the most severe and drastic. We've seen the most severe and drastic learning loss that we have ever seen in the history of the public education system. And that will have long-lasting impacts on our communities in our country and in our global population, I guess, too. But we don't know all of the ways in which COVID will impact society and human health. We're learning a lot more about long COVID, for example, and it's seeming like there's a direct correlation between long COVID and higher incidence of different sorts of chronic health diseases. But I think one of the problems with this sort of space and this problem set, and one of the reasons that I think healthy buildings haven't gotten the focus and the attention that they have until now is, this problem's invisible, and the timescale of the consequences developing is often on the order of years. It happens gradually sometimes. So it's a little bit hard to attribute to your environment. I think that there's the awareness that exists now, the demand that exists, and I think we're going to have more and more positive data points, positive correlations between healthy buildings and human health. So I think the flywheel has started to spin up, and to the extent that we keep seeing the demand for healthy buildings and invest in studying the impact of healthy buildings on humans, socially, societally, from a human health perspective, and the like. I think that it will only strengthen the demand for healthy buildings.
Thank you. So we've sort of established that scope and scale of the problem. So what is a healthy building? Joanna, do you want to start with that?
Sure, absolutely. And I would say it's a process. We're not prescribing that this is exactly how you have to design a building. So it's a 3-step process. The first is to understand the needs of the occupants of your building and the communities that they serve. The second is to then use a set of evidence-based design operational strategies in order to optimize the building or the community that you're working with. So use that evidence-based set of strategies. And then lastly, the third piece is to measure the outcomes. Really understand, like, are you having an impact on the health and the related financial outcomes that you were anticipating, and then to use that as a feedback loop. So that is kind of the basis of a healthy building, is really a process that you can go to, and it's applicable therefore to existing buildings as well as new construction. It's applicable to all buildings.
Yeah, Joanna's the expert. I learned much of what I know from her, so I won't attempt to add too much to that, but I will pick up on a few things that she mentioned. But I think there's a couple different schools of thoughts and frameworks for defining what a healthy building is. But the way that we think about it is it's sort of a philosophy and a process, like Joanna said. It's evolutionary, it's iterative, and it's sort of this ongoing feedback loop. But it's the philosophy and the philosophical change is, instead of thinking about the building itself and the building infrastructure, you think about the job to be done for that building and the people that it serves. So it's more of a shift to a human-centric sort of design principle, and really making that building work for the people that occupy it, and to facilitate that job to be done as well. So there are a number of different aspects and elements to healthy buildings. I would say there's not one right or wrong answer, but I think Joanna very elegantly described how it's sort of this process and this philosophy that's applied universally.
Yeah, and just to kind of build on that, the way that we look at the actual strategies, so just to get kind of like tangible, so that folks are like, what are they talking about? So the first thing that when we're looking with Fitwel, the first thing we're looking at are like, what is the location of that building? What does a streetscape look like? How walkable is it? Is this building located somewhere that's in walking distance to a park, to amenities, to transit, right? So first of all, look at the location. How human-centric is that location? Is it supporting physical activity and social interaction? The next, we're looking at the design of the building. So when I walk into that building, can I see a staircase? Do I have great natural light, et cetera? Like sort of the design elements. And there's a whole list of strategies that we know measurably impact health. The next is the other set of operational strategies. So operational strategies include indoor air quality, water quality, maintenance. If I have to stress enough, maintenance is probably one of the most important pieces around both physical health, but also mental health and building trust. And that's obviously something that the folks on this call, on this webinar, know a lot about. So maintenance is critical. And then lastly, the amenities that you're providing in the building. Whole long list of amenities that are directly correlated with health outcomes. So those are kind of the 4 buckets that we think about, just so people can get a handle on what it is we're talking about in a way that's tangible.
Very good. So Joanna, where is the Fitwel certification positioned in conjunction with other building standards, and how has it evolved?
Yeah, sure. So Fitwel is based on public health research. So it has that like 5,600 peer-reviewed research studies behind it, informing all of those design and operational strategies. So every strategy within Fitwel, whether it's your integrated pest management policy or your water quality standard or the testing protocols around indoor air quality or the way that you share indoor air quality information, all of those are based on evidence. All of them have a measurable impact on at least one of our health impact categories, and many of them have multiple impacts on physical, mental health, as well as equity and social health as well. So Fitwel is based on public health. It is very much looking at existing buildings as well as new construction, because we're really looking at how do we bring about market transformation around health for entire portfolios of buildings. So when we work with companies, we work at a portfolio level. So we're working with all of their existing assets, as well as informing the design of new assets also. So that's really important. In order to impact health, we have to impact everybody's health. So really important that we understand, like, how do we make incremental changes to our existing properties, as well as acing it for our new construction. So Fitwel is very much providing a roadmap for folks, as well as that certification. Benchmarking is at least as important to understand your portfolio-wide impact as the individual certification of assets. So we're based on public health. We were first created by the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, who everybody knows who they are these days. And so incredibly dense, deep body of evidence and a lot of expertise behind the standard. We also have an algorithm that's driving Fitwel that allows you to actually differentiate between each strategy. So it isn't just a checklist, it's actually a set of strategies that have a weighted number of points behind them, because that is a direct reflection of the measurable impact you're having on health. That's really important when it comes to metrics. It's really important when it comes to reporting for like your environmental, social, and governance reporting, your ESG reporting. You have to be able to have metrics that are quantifiable and that are backed by research and third-party certification. So that's kind of where Fitwel stands. We are really looking at quantifying the impact that design and operation has on the health of the occupants, and using the standard to bring about that market transformation that I know we are all really interested in pursuing, and it makes financial sense for the building industry as well.
Thank you. Well, let's dive down into it a little bit deeper and talk about, what are the benefits of healthy buildings? So what does the data tell us about the benefits of healthy buildings at the individual and the organizational level? And how can a thriving space influence personal and business outcomes? Grant, you want to lead us off on that one?
Yeah, so there are several benefits to healthy buildings, but it's good for humans. It's good for the bottom line of businesses that occupy these spaces, and it's also good for real estate owners. There are also studies that show that a healthy building can actually improve cognitive performance as well. So there's been studies that have been double-blind and shown that a group of people that are tested against 9 different cognitive domains perform better than people who are in buildings that don't have sort of healthy buildings infrastructure implemented as well. So the human aspect is, I think, a little bit more straightforward. For businesses, there's a couple of different elements here. So number one, if you think about a business's balance or income statement and their expenses, the number one line item for the biggest expense of virtually any building or any company is people. So people are the most expensive asset, and so optimizing the productivity of those people in that sort of aspect or that asset is a huge lever to pull. So if you can get 1% to 2% more productivity out of your employees in workforce, that's a massive ROI. So that's a huge aspect of it. There's also a number of different types of organizations where physical presence is required in order for the business to function. So think like manufacturing environments. If somebody's sick, they can't show up to work. Companies, we saw a number of companies through the pandemic miss their production targets, for example. There are roles that have a direct correlation between attendance and performance, like think call centers is a sort of a category that we work with quite a bit. but there's a direct correlation between sort of revenue generation in outbound sort of sales call centers and people showing up to work. There's also bottom line benefits to the health insurance premiums. On average, companies are spending close to $20,000 per employee per year to underwrite health insurance for them, and so those costs are rising year over year pretty precipitously, and COVID has driven drastic increases in health insurance premiums and increased costs for employers as well. So there's that benefit as well. And then for real estate owners, there's a number of different benefits, but primarily it makes your real estate asset more valuable. There was a study out of the Real Estate Innovation Lab at MIT that showed that buildings that have certifications like Fitwel or other similar certifications can command 4.4 to 7.7% higher rents. So not only can you sort of increase the value that you're generating from the asset, but also you can keep your buildings occupied. So in up markets, you attract elite tenants. In down markets, you have a differentiator to keep your building occupied. So there's a number of different benefits. I could go on for a while, but I'd love to hear Joanna add her 2 cents as well.
Sure. I'd say the only thing I'd add to that, we just did a study with one of our biggest users where they benchmarked 60 plus of their assets across their portfolio, and they overlaid that data with their tenant satisfaction survey. And what we found was a direct positive correlation between health promoting and health promoting strategies, so higher score of Fitwel and a higher net promoter score, higher levels of tenant satisfaction. And that's the first piece of research that has looked at that. So we can now say that there is a direct correlation between the more you do to promote health using the design and operation of the building, that will correlate, or that has correlated in that portfolio with tenant satisfaction. And folks in the real estate industry know that net promoter score and tenant satisfaction is directly correlated with other financial performance. So stickier tenants, higher levels of employee satisfaction, et cetera. So this was a really big deal. It just came out, and we will share it with folks afterwards. So you can kind of see the data for yourselves. I think what was really interesting about that is that when those tenant satisfaction surveys were conducted, there was no mention made of any of the strategies that were in place in those individual buildings around which Fitwel strategies were being used. And what was really interesting is that it was the operational strategies, so maintenance, integrated pest management, indoor air quality, it was those strategies that had the strongest correlation with tenant satisfaction. And people were not told, really important, people didn't know what the indoor air quality was. They weren't being told it, they were perceiving the difference. That building, if it was well maintained, super clean, the air quality was great, they were feeling the difference. So really fascinating stuff, and actually very encouraging that people do perceive a difference. And we could look at the negative too, that we already knew that a poorly maintained building was directly correlated with about a minus 10% impact on trust, which in this pandemic era is a very important indicator around trust. And whether you trust the people that are managing your building has a big impact on whether you're going to go into that building, whether it's residential or office building. So yeah, it's exciting. We've been avoiding answering that question for 4 years because we didn't have the data. And now we can say, yes, it is correlated. There is a direct outcome. And that goes to that kind of like, what is a healthy building? A healthy building is one that actually has an impact on people's health, right? Where they actually feel better and they have a more positive experience when they're in the building. People do respond to this. So, if that's the only thing you take away today, know that your work in maintaining those buildings and the way buildings are operated directly relates to tenant satisfaction.
Thank you. I know we're running just a little bit long, so for this question, maybe just give me one example of how COVID has accelerated the push for healthy buildings. Start with Joanna.
Risk. I'm not sure I need to say more than that. Risk. Before the pandemic, health and healthy buildings were seen as a nice to have. Like once I've done everything else, maybe I'll look at the health of the buildings. I hear that there's a certification I can do. Great. Now it's seen as a risk by investors. Therefore, you have to do something to demonstrate how you're impacting the health of the occupants of your building, because your investors will demand it. They'll demand it because they need to report on it for their ESG metrics. They'll also demand it because they now see the risk of not doing it. So rather than being a positive impact of having a healthy building pre-pandemic, where we're talking about positive impact on rent, now the concern, and I think that the reality is that health and promoting health for your building is now seen as table stakes. And if you can't show how you're promoting the health of occupants, you will lose tenants and you will not be able to command the same rent, and you will have lower occupancy levels, i.e. you will have a financial risk. So that's the big takeaway. Health is now a risk and therefore has a seat at the big table.
And I'll chime in and just add some nuance to that. I think we're seeing the market and business leaders see human health and healthy buildings as a business risk. So everything from supply chain continuity to productivity of their workforce and employees to costs. And so there's a number of different ways that that people are thinking about this in the market. But I think to put a fine point on it, what Joanna said is absolutely right. This is now a business risk, and this is not a nice to have anymore. This is an imperative and an obligation and sort of table stakes at this point.
All right, well, let's move into sort of the meat and potatoes of the discussion. So now that we've set that stage, get into some of the strategies and tools. So Joanna, you've said that the research and evidence base and studies tell us that how to create an environment that is optimized for people to create healthy buildings. It's not that hard. However, the number one theme our audience questions received was around actionable and cost-effective strategies. Based on your research, what are some examples of those strategies?
Sure. So I kind of laid out those 4 buckets, right, that we should be looking at, and kind of talked a little bit about like some locational strategies, design strategies. Fitwel was designed for existing buildings, right? So it was designed that these strategies would be cost effective and that you could do it out of an operational budget and wouldn't require a capital budget to do most of these strategies. So something as simple as putting signage in a building, reminding people to take the stairs, actually increases people's likelihood to take the stairs. 8% increase in stair taking just by a prompt saying, take the stairs, it's good for you. So we as humans are very responsive to signage. So that's a very low hanging fruit that any building can do. Maintenance. We've discussed maintenance. I'm going to bring it up again. Having high quality maintenance policies in place has a direct impact on people's physical health, their mental health, and levels of trust. That is an essential piece of a building. The way a building is operated, we just talked about it, has the greatest impact on tenant satisfaction. So that is your indoor air quality policy, right? These do not require a lot of capital expenditure, right? This is looking at how do I maintain my mechanical systems? How do I ensure that they're actually being commissioned on a regular basis and that they are operating per the specifications? That is your cleaning protocols, your maintenance, your integrated pest management. All of these operational policies don't require a lot of expenditure. It's really how are you running the buildings? The things that do require a lot of expenditure, you don't have to do them. Like moving a staircase is never going to happen. If it's new construction, you should build that staircase so you can see it. If it is an existing building and the stair is currently behind a steel door, the best thing that you could do is to signpost and say, the door's in the corner, it's open on every floor, and these are the benefits of taking the stair, right? You're not going to position a staircase. Maybe you could put in a glass door so folks can see into the stair. Like we know that increases people's likelihood to use the stairs. So Fitwel is super practical. They are not high cost strategies for the most part. And the ones that are, there's nothing that's a prerequisite, right? You can do it in any order. And the system itself, the way that Fitwel works is it actually creates a gap analysis per asset. So you can create a custom to-do list in the order of the greatest health impact. Food policy, as well is in there, creating community gardens. Again, these are not big capital outlays, right? This is really about like how are you prioritizing your time and effort working with your tenants?
Thank you. Grant, same question. What are the innovative operational strategies that you would suggest?
Yeah, so I mentioned a little bit earlier, R0, we focus on one sort of narrow segment of sort of healthy buildings, and that's the infection prevention aspect. And so, the good news is we know how diseases spread. There are fields of study in science, physics, epidemiology, and the like that define the mechanics of transmission and the types of activities that increase or decrease risk. And so we tend to focus on those. So one place to start is air. So look at your indoor air quality. Typically, the way that we work with customers is we try to understand their ventilation rates. How many air changes per hour are you getting in different parts of your building? And at the end of the day, buildings were not actually designed to keep us safe. And most buildings are underventilated because they were designed to ASHRAE 62.1, which is really optimizing for energy efficiency and thermal comfort. But not necessarily for human health. And so, generally speaking, most buildings are underventilated, and they need to improve their indoor air quality. So typically, we're seeing buildings get anywhere from 1 to 3 air changes per hour. 6 or more is going to give you a pretty monumental improvement in the health of the occupants of that building. And there are a couple of different ways to improve ventilation and increase the number of air changes per hour you're getting. One of them that we're seeing that's most common is HVAC. So we see a lot of our customers are just cranking up their HVAC to 11. That can incur 20 to 30% more operating costs on an ongoing basis. It increases maintenance, shortens the lifespan of your HVAC system, but it's also limited in efficacy. You might be able to go from 1 or 2 air changes per hour to maybe 3 or 4. Because your HVAC unit was sized specifically for that building. So, there are a number of ways to augment HVAC, and there are things like portable HEPA filters that you can put in rooms that are pretty common. We have a couple of different air disinfection products that do disinfection of the air in occupied spaces in real time. And so, Beam, for example, is a class of device called upper room UVGI. So we basically irradiate the top of the room where people don't interact with the UVC, and we can add between 6 and 12 air changes per hour to a given room without modifying the central HVAC system. So you get the several benefits to that, but there's also the operational costs that you can reduce as well. So we're helping a lot of our customers dial back their sort of pandemic level HVAC settings, but implement products like ours and achieve better quality indoor air, but for less operating costs than even before the pandemic as well. So that's one example. There are also other things we look at, like cleaning and disinfection protocols, to combat surface transmission of things like influenza, common cold, MRSA, and the like, and policies based on occupancy and how people interact within that space. So we have occupancy sensors as part of our platform. And the way people interact in a space is a huge determinant of risk. And so social distancing is the best sort of instantiation of this. So lots of people close together for a long time, more risk. Fewer people standing farther apart for less time, less risk. So if we can understand how people are interacting within the space, then we can actually inform different changes to policies. Maybe caps on the number of people you can have in a conference room, for example, and things like that. So there's some pretty basic and straightforward things, but that you can do. And we typically focus on improving indoor air quality, automating or streamlining the operations around the cleaning and disinfection protocols, and also surfacing insights that can inform changes in policy and behavior that influence risk as well. So. One last thing I'll say too, I saw a question in the chat that I'll try to hit on. There's an unprecedented amount of funding that exists today that's accessible to organizations of all shapes and sizes, from schools to Fortune 500 enterprises and everything in between. So there's the American Rescue Plan, there's the new infrastructure bill, I know there's a good amount of a good chunk of dollars that are allocated towards modernizing the infrastructure of a lot of different public municipalities and public organizations as well. For schools, it tends to be more around ESSER funding. And for senior care and healthcare, there's a number of different sources of funding as well. But it really depends on the industry. It depends on your location as well, generally administered by the state. But I think that there's an unprecedented amount of dollars that can be invested and make a massive step change improvement in the health of the built environment nationwide, in the United States at least.
Thank you for that. Now we're running a little bit long here, so we're going to get into some of the question and answers. Just want to remind everybody that the recording will be made available. So after the session, let's start off with some of the questions that were submitted in advance of the presentation here today. So one was, what are your recommendations for office building owners for healthy building strategies that will promote occupant well-being and productivity? And so we'll ask both of you to answer it, but I'll start with Joanna.
Sure. So I think you have to understand now as an office owner or as an employer that you're competing with people's, excuse me, a home office. So it's, how do you create an environment in the office that is actually optimized and entices people to come back into the office? So your indoor air quality actually is one of the big opportunities here, because most folks in their own homes don't have sophisticated HVAC systems, right? So really being able to talk to your employees about the great indoor air quality that you can offer them. Also climate control. I mean, I live in New York City. It's been very hot here and I have a fan. So, being able to demonstrate like this is the environment that we are offering you in an office is really important. Also understanding that social interaction, if we come back to that again, is also incredibly important for people's health. So within an office environment, creating spaces for social interaction, really putting a lot of resources into creating food access, great coffee, all of those things. They sound like something that's fluff, but actually I think we've all just shown that social interaction is really necessary both for our mental health and for productivity, and it also entices people back into the office space. Again, that benchmarking study, we saw the subset of strategies that had the greatest impact on Net Promoter Score were healthy food access. People really value access to healthy food in the office environment. So understanding that, I think these are things that you can do. Having great greenery as well in an office, that biophilia, being able to see plants, whether it's outside or whether it's within the office space, having great natural daylight and views as well. That impacts people's mental health. It also impacts their productivity. So it's in your interest as a business owner to really have an excellent daylit space, understanding that you need to also then have shading controls in place because of glare and also because of heat. You don't want to have a huge amount of heat build up in the space that you then have to disperse. So a lot of different pieces you need to be thinking, how do I create the best possible environment for a person to thrive in? People want choices. They want that feeling when they go into a space that they are really being prioritized. So those are some strategies that we are seeing folks put into place.
I love everything that you just said. One of the ways that we see the world is we're kind of solving two problems. There's safety and there's trust. The safety piece is a little bit more obvious. How do we physically keep people safer, healthier in the built environment? But the trust piece really stems from the idea that there's sort of psychological scar tissue lingering in the eyes and the minds of the public coming out of COVID. So not only do people want to physically be safer, they want to feel safer as well. And in addition to the things Joanna mentioned, I want to hit on what I think is a very important component of this equation, and that's communication. And so I think it's critically important to be able to communicate and articulate the changes that are being made to keep the occupants safe. One, it's just good for the engagement, good for the employees to have that information that can contribute to trust building and that feeling of safety as well. But also you as a facilities manager, building owner, building tenant, you should get credit for the investments that you're making in the health of your employees or occupants of your space. And so it's a multi-pronged sort of approach there. But I think at the highest level, there's a million different solutions. There's a lot of information out there. Frankly, there's a lot of noise in snake oil as well. So what we recommend from a process perspective, it's very sort of tactically answering this question is, start with understanding what your risk is. So we, as a company, we will actually help you do that, and we'll come out and we'll audit your space. We'll understand, the size and the shape of the rooms, the physical characteristics, the ventilation, how it's used, things like that, and we will actually quantify the risk in each specific room. And then what we'll do is we'll actually help make a recommendation. So once you understand your risk, it's time to choose science-based solutions. And I think quality and value are what we would recommend. There's a lot of sort of very inexpensive products that frankly just don't work, which is a slightly different topic. But make sure that you're going with science-based solutions that are backed with, the claims are backed by third-party data, and that you understand the science and technology that underlies whatever the solution is that you're putting in place. And then, the last piece of this after implementation would be communication as well. And then, in addition to those things, as Joanna mentioned, and I won't go too deep, but measuring and monitoring on an ongoing basis. Risk is dynamic. Human health is dynamic. So measuring and monitoring, and then iterating based on what you're seeing to ultimately improve over time is what we would recommend as well.
Yeah, and just to build on that, the communication piece is essential. You need to, even though I mentioned earlier, folks respond regardless of whether you tell them, they respond much better when you do tell them. But there are ways to communicate that, again, are evidence-based. So in our viral response module, we actually have a whole series of ways to communicate, because there are ways to communicate that is actually going to garner more trust. You need to be consistent. It needs to be specific. It needs to be two-way communication. Like public health has looked at communication as well as all of these other built environment pieces that we're talking about. So there is a whole subset of public health expertise, which is public health communication. Important to know that you don't need to make this up for yourselves, right? There is already a roadmap out there. There's already a way of doing this that has been researched and has been shown to be the most effective. So communication is very important.
Thank you. Grant, I think this question goes to you. Do you envision indoor air quality standards becoming mandatory for schools and business environments?
That's a great question. Short answer is yes. And frankly, I think it's crazy that we don't have any sort of regulation around the air that we breathe 18 to 20,000 times a day. I think it's crazy that we regulate the water that we drink maybe a liter or two of a day, but do nothing to regulate indoor air quality. And so you're starting to see, the White House just came out with the Clean Air in Buildings checklist. The EPA has the Clean Air in Buildings challenge. And I think that these types of guidelines will get baked into building code. I think they're going to get baked into legislation that will come out as well. So interested if you have anything to add, Joanna. But my belief is that that this will eventually make its way into building code and into national and local regulations.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I would say that process will take time. What we're seeing from a marketplace standpoint, actually, even though I have maybe proximity to policy, is that the market is moving way faster than policy. So if we come back to what those investors are demanding, the investment community, so your pension plans, your sovereign wealth funds, all your institutional investors, because they're now seeing health as a risk, the three metrics that they're looking at the most closely as far as risk is concerned are tenant satisfaction, walkability, and indoor air quality. So indoor air quality is already on the radar of institutional investors. They are already looking for metrics and quantifying it as far as their kind of investment portfolio is concerned, as far as their risk assessment is concerned. So certainly from the real estate perspective, it is moving very quickly. to embrace these changes, because in order to go out and borrow money to secure investment from basically anybody at this point, and if you're a publicly traded company, you also have to report on environmental, social, and governance metrics. So all of this kind of daylight and requirements to report is going to change the market, and is already changing the market incredibly quickly. So I think that is going to happen in advance of regulation coming in, because real estate is all about return on investment, folks, right? How do you maximize the value of your property, of your portfolio? And now promoting health, and specifically indoor air quality, is part of that equation. So it's happening fast. It's happening real time.
Well, thank you. And I don't know if you can see this, but I have a CO2 monitor that sits on my desk. So.
Right. Well, that's another thing I would say, that we work with a lot of building owners and investors, and the last thing you want is for your tenants to have more information about the indoor air quality of the building that they are tenants in than you have as the owner, right? That is not acceptable. And we're seeing that also driving this change to both being able to set policies around indoor air quality, act on those policies by changing your HVAC systems and your mechanical systems, and then sharing the results, right? That's a big one. That's a different kind of risk, but sharing the indoor air quality results is actually a separate strategy in Fitwel, because we understand that that's a difficult thing to do. But yeah, you don't want every individual in your building knowing more about the building than you do.
Dean, you got to open a window.
It's not bad, but I had the door closed here for the last hour, so it started out about 600.
Yeah, no, I love everything Joanna said again, but I think that one anecdote to share is we did sort of secret shopping where we sent out close to 100 industrial hygienists to common spaces, from airports to hotels to restaurants, bars, and the like, and we took air and surface samples from all of those common spaces. We found human pathogens in 54% of our air and surface samples that we took, and we took hundreds. We found SARS-CoV-2 in the air in 36% of samples, and we found some pretty nasty bugs that you don't want to and should not be outside of a hospital, frankly. And so this problem is invisible, and people don't fully understand the risk that surrounds them every day, because it's microscopic. There's no sort of acute sort of like moment that you get sick, and there's no attribution as well. So this problem's existed forever, and it's time we start focusing on improving our response to it and how we react.
Yep, thank you. I'm actually scheduled to get my next COVID booster this afternoon. Since we're running short on time, I think we're going to move to there's a slide we have that shows kind of the 4 myths that we wanted to present, and hopefully we've been able to dispel some of those here. For closing remarks, Joanna, can you give us like 30 seconds on how you'd like to close?
Sure. I would like everybody listening to understand that this is very doable, right? That the next thing to do is to go out there. I mean, you can download Fitwel for free and just start to look at this list, right? Like, understand what we mean when we're talking about health. Like, it's a very broad subject. A lot of the strategies are things that you are already doing. So know that you're already doing so much and feel empowered, right? This is very doable. And the facility management community is an absolutely essential piece of the equation. We were actually first created by the General Service Administration facility managers alongside the CDC. So I'm excited that we're engaging with all of you guys.
Grant?
Yeah, I think what I'll leave you with is hopefully some inspiration. But I think that facilities managers have had one of the toughest tasks and tallest orders since the beginning of the pandemic. So facilities managers historically and traditionally have been building experts, building infrastructure experts, automation experts, those types of things. Now they're expected to be epidemiologists and healthy buildings experts. And so first wanted to recognize that, but I think the implications here are that the role of the facilities manager is evolving and changing. The role of the workplace is changing as well. And we have a once in a generation opportunity to reimagine the built environment with human health and sustainability at its core. And really, it's all of you. It's facilities managers that get to lead that charge and get to make the impact on your organization and the human health of your employee base as well. So I think it's probably daunting for a lot of people. There's a lot to learn. It's deep, complex, technical. We as a company are here to help. There's an educational process, in every relationship that we build with our customers. And so, I think there's no better time to start than now. Poke around at Fitwel, check out that certification, reach out to us. We'd be happy to help you understand your risk and the options that are available to you. But the only wrong thing to do is nothing. So I think there's a huge opportunity here for facilities managers globally to take the lead and really advance and proliferate the healthy buildings movement.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Joanna and Grant. And I want to thank all the participants today. We're right at our time here, so we want to respect everybody's time. Just to close out, don't miss R0's follow-up webinar. Thank you again.